It was wrong, stupid, reckless, completely off limits, but that night, none of it mattered. It was Jake's birthday, his 23rd, and the loft was vibrating with his friends. Half were wasted, bellowing laughter that bounced off the exposed brick. The other half sprawled on furniture like they owned the place. I wasn't supposed to be there, hadn't been invited, not really. But something about the city night, about Jake, pulled me in. Liar that I was, I told myself I was just checking on things, making sure the place wasn't trashed before Richard got back from his upstate fishing trip. But I didn't dress the part of concerned stepmom. Instead, I'd pulled on an oversized hoodie, the soft gray one that barely grazed my thighs, and nothing else. By the time I got to the Tribeca loft, the party was fizzling out. A few stragglers loitered in the kitchen island. Someone passed out on a beanbag in the corner. The air hung thick with stale beer and cheap cologne. I saw Jake leaning against the stainless steel fridge, a bottle of bourbon in one hand, his sleeves rolled up, showing off the kind of forearms I'd been trying not to notice for weeks. When he saw me, his eyes widened, just a fraction, then dropped, taking in the hoodie, the bare stretch of leg beneath. He didn't say anything for a beat, but the look was enough to send a jolt of heat through me. "You're late to the party," he said finally, his voice even, but his eyes were anything but. "Just checking in," I shrugged, playing it casual. His lips quirked, a hint of a smirk, but he didn't push it. The air between us was thick, almost suffocating, but neither of us named it. As the last of his friends stumbled out, I stayed, grabbing a stray beer can from the counter, pretending to tidy up. The loft went quiet, the only sound the low hum of the city outside. Jake watched me from across the room, that same unreadable look in his eyes. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I don't mind," I replied, my heart hammering against my ribs. And I didn't mind. Deep down, I already knew where the night was headed. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the massive windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the fancy espresso machine as it sputtered and hissed, filling the loft with the rich scent of coffee. My mind, though, was anything but soothed. I kept replaying the way Jake had looked at me when his friends cleared out, the heat in his gaze as he'd leaned in, his fingers brushing mine when he took the empty can. "You don't have to go," he'd murmured, his voice so insistent. I'd told myself I stayed to help clean, but we both knew that was a lie. Nothing had happened. Not yet. But the tension had been a live wire, and the way he looked at me made it clear he felt it too. 6 months ago, Jake had been background noise. He'd moved into the converted studio downstairs after finishing NYU, claiming he needed space to find himself. Richard, my husband, his father, barely blinked an eye. Jake wasn't trouble, didn't ask for much. He worked part-time at some tech startup downtown, spent the rest of his time at the gym or out with friends. At first, I barely registered him being around. I'd married Richard 10 years ago, long after Jake was grown, and our relationship with him had always been polite, distant. I was the stepmom who remembered birthdays, offered coffee when he visited. That was it. But something shifted when he moved in. He wasn't the gangly kid I vaguely remembered from holidays. Jake was different now. Confident, broad-shouldered, with sharp features that snagged my attention in ways I absolutely didn't want to admit. He had this quiet intensity, a presence that filled a room without trying. I started noticing the small things, the way his voice dropped when he spoke to me, the way he lingered a beat too long when he passed me in the narrow hallway, the way his eyes lingered on me just a fraction too long. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, projecting, but then the signs became impossible to ignore. 2 weeks before his birthday, there was another moment. Smaller, but sharper. I was on the terrace, tending the herb garden, the late afternoon sun beating down on my shoulders. I was wearing a simple sundress, linen, but it clung in the heat. Didn't think twice about it. Richard was at his office. Jake rarely surfaced during the day. But when I turned back toward the loft windows, I saw him. He was standing there watching me. His face was partially obscured by the glass, but I saw the way his eyes moved, tracing the line of my body. He didn't look away when I caught him, held my gaze, a faint smirk playing on his lips. A flush crept up my neck, my heart slamming against my ribs. I turned back to the herbs, pretending to prune basil, but the look he gave me burned. It stayed with me long after I'd gone inside, put the gardening gloves away. From that day, things shifted. Jake started leaving notes, casual at first. A sticky note on the fridge, out of milk. A slip of paper tucked into my real estate files. Love the blue dress today. Innocent enough maybe, but the way they made my stomach flip told a different story. I started changing too, lingering in the kitchen longer when he was around, finding excuses to talk to him. catching myself choosing tighter jeans, lower cut tops on days I knew he'd be home. I hated myself for it. I was a grown woman, married, with a career, a reputation. And yet, Jake had unlocked something I thought had been dormant for years. Richard, of course, noticed nothing. My husband had always been practical, more focused on quarterly reports and golf schedules than on me. Not unkind exactly, just distant, preoccupied. He'd sold his tech company a few years back, and his days were filled with trading stocks online, golfing at the club, and networking lunches that stretched into late afternoons. Our marriage was stable, predictable, utterly passionless. It had been years since he'd touched me in a way that felt real, and I'd stopped trying to bridge the gap long ago. Jake was everything Richard wasn't. Young, vibrant, alive. Every time he looked at me, it felt like waking up after years of sleepwalking. The week leading up to his birthday was a blur of anticipation and guilt. I told myself I wouldn't go to the party. Staying away was the only sane thing to do. But the closer it got, the more restless I became. The night of the party, I stayed upstairs in our penthouse apartment, listening to the muffled bass and laughter drifting up through the floor. Telling myself I was being responsible, giving Jake his space. But as the hours ticked by, I found myself getting dressed, pulling on that damn hoodie, slipping out the back service door before I could talk myself out of it. Now, standing in Jake's loft kitchen the morning after, the weight of what almost happened settled on me like a hangover. I poured myself an espresso, my hands shaking slightly. I needed to get a grip. Nothing had happened. And if I was smart, nothing ever would. But then Jake walked into the kitchen, hair damp from the shower, a simple white t-shirt clinging to his chest. My resolve wavered. He gave me a small smile, his eyes meeting mine with that same intensity that had been haunting me for weeks. "Morning," he said, his voice low. "Morning," I replied, my pulse spiking as he poured himself coffee. I caught him glancing at me sideways, the silence thick with everything we weren't saying. I told myself to walk away, to leave the loft, before I did something irreversible. But my feet stayed rooted to the polished concrete floor, my heart pounding as he stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking. This was just the beginning. Jake's birthday party had been a test of restraint. The morning after was worse. Every time he moved, every time his eyes flicked to mine, I felt the unspoken tension crackling between us. I hated myself for not doing the responsible thing, for not walking away, drawing a clear line. But I didn't. Later that afternoon, Richard called. He was staying another night upstate. The fishing was unexpectedly good. Normally, the news would have been background noise. This time, it felt like the universe was deliberately clearing the path for disaster. Jake spent most of the day downstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I threw myself into busy work, organizing closets, answering emails, anything to keep my mind from replaying the way Jake's lips had parted when he looked at me last night, the way my body had responded just being near him. By evening, I was exhausted, but wired. The penthouse felt too quiet, the air too heavy. I poured myself a glass of Pinot Grigio, stepped out onto the wraparound terrace, hoping the cool city breeze would settle my nerves. Then Jake appeared. He came out of the downstairs studio, barefoot, wearing just a t-shirt and sweatpants slung low on his hips. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, hands shoved in pockets, his gaze locked on mine. "Can't sleep?" he finally asked, his voice low, almost tentative. "Something like that," I replied, taking a gulp of wine to steady myself. He walked closer, each step deliberate, and sat down on the edge of the low wall bordering the terrace. "It's nice out here," he said, looking up at the stars, or what you could see of them through the city glow. I nodded, but I wasn't looking at the sky. I was looking at him. The silence stretched, comfortable at first, then quickly morphing into something heavier, more charged. I told myself to get up, go inside, end this before it started. But when he turned to me, his eyes finding mine, I knew it was already too late. "Last night," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the city hum, "you look different." I felt my cheeks flush, turned away, pretending to focus on my wine glass. "It was just a hoodie." "It wasn't just the hoodie," he said, his voice firm. My breath hitched. I glanced at him, found him closer than I expected. He wasn't smiling now. His expression was serious, his eyes searching mine for something. "Jake," I began, my voice trembling, but I didn't know how to finish. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. "You felt it too, didn't you?" I opened my mouth to answer, to deny it, to say anything, but before I could, his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, like he was giving me an out. But I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The wine glass slipped from my fingers, landing on the terrace with a soft thud as I leaned into him, my hands gripping his t-shirt. His touch was cautious, almost reverent, like he couldn't quite believe this was happening. "Are you sure?" he whispered against my lips, his voice thick with hesitation. Was I sure? Absolutely not. But my body had already made the decision. "Yes," I breathed, barely recognizing my own voice. The hesitation vanished. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. My heart hammered in my chest, every rational thought drowned out by the sheer, raw intensity of the moment. We didn't make it back downstairs. The terrace lounge chairs became our sanctuary, the cool night air a stark contrast to the fire between us. His touch was firm, but gentle, his lips exploring every inch of my skin as if he was trying to memorize me. For the first time in years, I felt desired. Truly desired. Not the way Richard touched me, out of habit, out of routine, but with a hunger that made me forget everything else. When it was over, we sat there in silence, the reality of what we'd done slowly sinking in. I pulled the hoodie tighter around me, my fingers trembling as I reached for the spilled wine glass on the stone tiles. "I don't regret it," Jake said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked at him, his face soft in the moonlight filtering through the skyscrapers, and felt my chest tighten. "We can't do this again," I said, though the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Why not?" he asked, his voice steady. "Because it's wrong," I said, more to myself than to him. He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't going to let this be the end. The next few days were a blur of stolen glances, unspoken words. I avoided Jake as much as possible, throwing myself into work, pretending nothing had changed. But it was impossible to ignore the way my heart leaped every time I saw him, the way his gaze lingered on me, longer than it should. It didn't take long for him to break the silence. One evening, after Richard had gone to bed, I found Jake waiting for me in the kitchen. He was leaning against the island, arms crossed, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Hey," he said, his voice casual but his eyes burned. "Hey," I replied, my pulse quickening. "We need to talk," he said, his tone soft but firm. I hesitated, glancing toward the elevator, making sure Richard was still upstairs. "About what?" "About us," he said, stepping closer. "There is no us," I said quickly, though my voice lacked conviction. He raised an eyebrow, his smile widening. "Really? Because it didn't feel that way the other night." I felt my cheeks flush, turned away, busying myself with rinsing a glass in the sink. But he didn't let me escape. He moved closer, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for a coffee mug on the counter. "You don't have to pretend," he said softly, his voice sending a shiver down my spine. I closed my eyes, my hands gripping the edge of the sink. "This has to stop," I whispered. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because of him." I didn't answer. Couldn't. Jake moved closer, his hand resting on my waist. "You deserve to be happy, Lorraine, and I think I make you happy." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. His expression was serious, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. Before I could stop myself, I kissed him. That night, we found ourselves in his studio apartment downstairs, the small space filled with the soft glow of the bedside lamp. It was reckless, dangerous, but I didn't care. Jake made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years, and I wasn't ready to let that go. There's a point in every bad decision where you realize there's no turning back. For me, that moment came one night in Jake's studio, lying in his bed, his arm draped across my waist like it had always belonged there. We didn't talk much after those nights. What could we say that didn't make it worse? Words like "this is wrong" or "this has to stop" felt pointless when my body kept betraying me, my heart racing every time he looked at me like I was the only thing he wanted in the world. It didn't stop. If anything, it escalated. Our affair became a rhythm, dangerous, intoxicating, impossible to resist. We became experts at finding stolen moments, sometimes in the studio, blinds drawn tight, the TV murmuring to mask any sounds. Other times in my car, parked in a deserted lot in Queens or a quiet stretch of beach on Long Island. Each time felt like the first, the thrill of secrecy coursing through my veins. The way Jake touched me made me forget everything. Richard, the penthouse, the life I'd built. I wasn't someone's wife or stepmother. I was just Lorraine. One of our most reckless moments happened in my office, a sleek space in a midtown skyscraper. I'd been working late, buried in property listings and staging schedules, when Jake called. "You alone?" he asked, his voice low, teasing. "Yeah," I said, leaning back in my leather chair. "I'm coming over." "Jake," just like that. He'd already hung up. 20 minutes later, he walked through the door. He was wearing a leather jacket, his hair damp from the city rain, and the look on his face made my breath catch. "Jake, this is..." I started, but he didn't let me finish. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling me to my feet, kissing me before I could protest. "You've been working too hard," he murmured against my lips, his hands sliding down to my hips. It was insane, stupid, but the second he touched me, every thought evaporated. We ended up tangled together on the modern sofa in my private office, the sound of rain against the panoramic windows the only witness to our indiscretion. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to hide. Richard, oblivious as he was, started noticing things. How I seemed distracted at dinner. How I was suddenly spending more time downstairs in Jake's studio under the flimsy guise of helping with paperwork. Then there was Marcy, my best friend, sharp, perceptive, able to read me like a book. Lately, she'd been giving me looks that made my stomach clench. One afternoon, we were having lunch at a trendy spot in Soho when she finally said it. "You seem different lately," she said, her tone casual but her eyes probing. "Different? How?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. She shrugged, stirring her iced coffee. "I don't know, distracted, like you're hiding something." I forced a laugh. "I think you're imagining things." "Am I?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Her gaze lingered on me for a beat longer before she dropped it, but I knew she wasn't convinced. Then there was Richard. Not an attentive man by any stretch, but not stupid either. He started coming home earlier, showing up unannounced at the office during lunch, asking more questions than he ever had before. "Why were you in Jake's studio yesterday evening?" he asked one night, his tone deceptively casual, his eyes sharp. "Jake needed help with some documents for a new freelance gig," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Richard didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me made my chest tighten. The close calls only amplified the thrill, the danger. One night, after Richard had gone to bed, I slipped out of the penthouse and down to the studio. I didn't bother knocking. Jake was waiting, a lazy, confident smile as he pulled me inside. "What if he wakes up?" I asked, even as Jake's hands found my waist. "He won't," he said, his voice low, reassuring. But halfway through the night, we heard it. Footsteps outside the studio door. My heart stopped. I scrambled to straighten my clothes, Jake's expression shifting from calm to alarm in an instant. The doorknob rattled, but didn't turn. "Jake?" Richard's voice muffled from the other side of the door. Jake opened it just a crack, peeking out. "Yeah, Dad?" Richard looked at him suspiciously, his eyes flicking to the rumpled sheets on the futon behind him. "What are you doing out here so late?" "Couldn't sleep," Jake said smoothly. "Thought I'd watch some TV." Richard stared at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Don't stay up too late." He walked away. When he was gone, I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding. "That was too close," I whispered. Jake smirked, pulling me back into his arms. Close makes it exciting. But the excitement couldn't last. The cracks were showing. Marcy became more persistent, her probing questions harder to deflect. Richard's behavior grew erratic, his once blind trust eroding, replaced by sharp, pointed interrogations. And then there was Jake. The closer we got, the more possessive he became. He resented the time I spent with Richard, even if it was just forced dinners at the same table. He started showing up unannounced at my office more often, texting constantly, demanding to know where I was when I wasn't with him. "You don't belong with him," he said one night, his voice low but hard. "You belong with me." "It's not that simple," I replied, my chest tightening. "Why not?" he demanded, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What are you so afraid of?" "Everything," I wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. The tension between us reached a breaking point one afternoon when Marcy showed up at the penthouse unexpectedly. She caught me coming out of Jake's studio, my hair a mess, my cheeks flushed. "Lorraine," she said, her voice sharp. "What the hell are you doing?" I froze, my mind racing for a plausible lie, but the look on her face told me she already knew. "You can't keep doing this," she said, her voice low, urgent. "If Richard finds out—" "Marcy, please," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't say anything." Her eyes softened, but her jaw remained tight. "You need to end this, Lorraine, before it's too late." But deep down, I knew it already was. The walls were closing in. It was only a matter of time before everything imploded. It started with a text. I was at the office, flipping through property listings, trying to focus. When my phone buzzed on the desk, it was from Jake. "We need to talk tonight." The message made my stomach drop. Jake's texts were usually playful, flirty, teasing. This one felt different. Urgent, serious. I typed out a quick reply. "What's wrong?" His response came instantly. Just come to the studio after dinner. It's important. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. That evening, dinner with Richard was excruciating. He barely spoke, pushing food around his plate with a look I couldn't decipher. Normally, his silence would have been a relief. Tonight, it felt heavy, suffocating. As soon as the dishes were cleared, I excused myself, claiming I had work to finish. Richard didn't respond, just grunted and turned on the TV. I slipped out of the penthouse and made my way downstairs. The cool night air did little to calm my nerves. When I opened the studio door, Jake was pacing the small living room, his face tight with worry. "What's going on?" I asked, closing the door behind me. He stopped pacing, looked at me, his jaw clenched. "It's Adam." Adam, Jake's friend. The one who'd been giving me those knowing looks for weeks, like he was putting pieces together. "What about him?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "He knows," Jake said, his voice low. "He saw us texting, and he's threatening to tell Dad." The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. Why would he do that? "He thinks he's helping," Jake said bitterly. "Says this is messed up, that Dad deserves to know." My mind raced. If Adam told Richard, it would be over. Everything. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jake stepped closer, his hands gripping my shoulders. "We end it before he can. We tell him ourselves." I stared at him, my heart hammering. "Are you insane? That would destroy him." "It's better than him finding out from Adam," Jake argued, his voice rising. "At least we can control the story." But there was no controlling this, no softening the blow. The decision was made for us. The next day, I was home, cleaning up the kitchen, when Richard walked in holding a manila envelope. His expression was unreadable, but the tension radiating off him made my stomach churn. "What's this?" he asked, dropping the envelope on the granite countertop in front of me. I froze, staring at it like it was a bomb. I don't know," I said carefully. "Open it," he said, his voice dangerously calm. My hand shook as I tore open the envelope. Inside were photos. Grainy, but damning. Me and Jake in the studio, me leaving his room late at night. And the worst one, the two of us kissing in my office parking garage, the city skyline blurred behind us. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Do you have anything to say?" Richard asked, his tone ice cold. "Richard, he snapped, slamming his hand on the counter. "Don't you dare lie to me." Before I could speak, Jake walked into the kitchen. His eyes flicked to the envelope on the counter, and I saw the panic flare in his face. "Dad," he started, but Richard cut him off. Just don't." Richard's voice was shaking with rage. "How long has this been going on?" Neither of us answered. "That's what I thought," Richard said, his voice dripping with disgust. He turned to me, his face twisted with betrayal. "I trusted you. I married you. And this is what you do?" "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "Sorry doesn't fix this," he spat. He turned to Jake, his fist clenched. "And you're supposed to be my son. My own damn son." Jake stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Dad, it's not what you think." "You don't get to explain," Richard roared, his voice echoing through the penthouse. Then, in one swift motion, he swung at Jake. The fight was brutal, chaotic. Richard's fist connected with Jake's jaw, sending him staggering back. But Jake recovered quickly, shoving Richard against the kitchen island. "Stop it!" I screamed, but neither of them heard me. Richard lunged again, grabbing Jake's shirt as they grappled, the sound of crashing furniture filling the room. For a split second, I thought they might actually kill each other. Then it happened. Jake shoved Richard hard, and he lost his footing. He fell backward, his head striking the sharp corner of the granite island with a sickening crack. Everything went still. "Dad!" Jake's voice broke the silence, trembling with panic. I rushed to Richard's side, my hands shaking as I pressed them against his head. Blood seeped through my fingers, his breathing shallow, ragged. "Call 911, I said, my voice shaking. Jake fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed. The paramedics arrived quickly, but it felt like an eternity. They loaded Richard onto a stretcher, their expressions grim, and rushed him out of the penthouse. Jake and I stood in the wrecked kitchen, the aftermath of the fight scattered around us. Neither of us spoke. "This is my fault," Jake said finally, his voice hollow. "No," I said, though the word felt meaningless. We both knew the truth. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and suffocating silence. Richard survived the fall, but the damage was significant. Concussion, fractured skull. The doctor said he was lucky it wasn't worse. They kept him in the hospital for observation, but I didn't go to see him. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed in the penthouse, pacing, the weight of everything we'd done pressing down on me like a physical force. Richard came home 3 days later. He was quiet, pale, his movements slow, but his eyes burned with a cold fury. We didn't speak much, just clipped sentences about practicalities. That night, after Jake had retreated to the studio, Richard finally confronted me. "You're leaving," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. I stared at him, my throat tight. "Richard, You don't get to explain," he snapped, his voice rising, cracking. "You've humiliated me, destroyed this family. You're lucky I haven't called the cops." My breath hitched. I looked away. "You have until the end of the week to pack your things," he said, his tone final. "And if you try to see Jake again, I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. Everyone." The words cut deeper than I expected, but I nodded. I didn't have a choice. The next morning, I started packing. Jake came up to the penthouse while Richard was out, his face pale, drawn. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice trembling. His expression shifted, panic flashing in his eyes. "What do you mean you're leaving?" "I don't have a choice," I said, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "Richard knows. He's giving me a way out, and I'm taking it." Jake stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. "You can't just leave. You don't have to do what he says." "Yes, I do," I said, meeting his gaze. "This is over, Jake. It has to be." He knelt in front of me, his hands resting on my knees. "We can leave together, start over somewhere else. Just you and me." His words sent a pang of longing through my chest, but I shook my head. "That's not realistic, Jake. You have your whole life ahead of you. I can't take that away from you." "You're not taking anything from me," he said, his voice breaking. "You're the only thing I want." Tears blurred my vision as I reached out, cupping his face in my hands. "I love you," I whispered, "but this isn't right. You know it isn't." He didn't say anything, just pulled me into his arms and held me like he was afraid to let go. By the end of the week, I was gone. I moved into a small, sterile apartment in Brooklyn, a world away from the penthouse I'd called home for 10 years. It was quiet, lonely, but it was what I deserved. Jake tried to call a few times, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. I needed to let him go, for both our sakes. Months crawled by. The divorce was finalized swiftly. Richard wanted nothing to do with me, and I didn't fight him on anything. He kept the penthouse, the cars, everything. I walked away with what little dignity I had left. One gray afternoon, rain lashing against the windows of my Brooklyn apartment, a letter arrived. It was from Jake. The envelope was plain, no return address, but I recognized his handwriting instantly. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Lorraine, I'm sorry for everything, for hurting you, for ruining your life. I know you probably hate me for leaving, but I don't. I understand why you did it. I just wanted you to know that I'm okay. I'm starting over. And I hope you are too. Maybe someday, when the dust settles, we can talk. I'd like that. Until then, take care of yourself. Jake." I stared at the letter for a long time, the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. Part of me ached to write back, to tell him I missed him, to say I wanted to see him again. But another part, a stronger, more sensible part, knew it was better this way. I folded the letter carefully, set it aside. Maybe someday, I thought, but not today.